So moving on, now I'm actually going to get into the meat of this tutorial, which is how to use the edit poly functions as they pertain to modeling. So first thing I'm going to do, to convert an object to an editable poly, you need to right click on the object, and you'll have a whole bunch of options here. Actually, I'll show you a few of these in a second because they can tend to be useful as well. But you right click on the object, and at the very bottom here it says convert to editable mesh, editable poly, editable patch, or convert to NURBS. I usually just go with editable poly. There are some instances where you would like to use an editable mesh, but rarely. Most of the time I say convert to editable poly, and all of the time when dealing with polygonal modeling. So convert to editable poly. And before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm just going to show you some of these other things here that I use. A lot of these are repeats of things that you can find elsewhere, so I won't talk about those too much, but I'm just going to show you a few of the important options. One of them is object properties, and under here you can define a lot of various different properties. You can choose to make the object see-through if you want. You can just display it as a box if you have too many objects in your scene and you want to make your viewport rendering speed up again. Backface culling is kind of useful and fairly important sometimes, so I tend to use that a lot. And trajectory is something used for animation. Probably the rest of these I won't talk about too much for the purposes of this tutorial, but basically backface cull is the most important one under here. What that does, I'll show you really quickly, is it makes the backs of faces see-through, so it doesn't draw the backs of faces. And that can be very useful at times. I usually tend to leave it on, but if you turn it off, then you will get the renderer rendering the back polygons as well, and it just renders them as black. But I tend not to really like to leave that on. So I'm just going to undo this here, and then go back to object properties, backface cull. Now, back to the edit poly. So we took this object and we turned it into an editable poly. So if we go over to the Modify tab now, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of options that just opened up to my right here. These are the edit poly options, and these are where polygonal modeling really comes into play. So first at the top, I'm just going to show you, we have our name again. We also have the object color. This is where you can change the actual color of the object itself, not to be confused with the material color. You'll see that I just changed the color of the object to black. And since it has no material applied to it, when I deselect away from it, it just looks like a black blob, and you can barely see any shading happening, except in some very few instances where I get a bit of specularity. So, again, if I try to change the color to something else, then you're going to see the object as whatever color that is that I change it to. Likewise, if you go to wireframe, your lines will also be displayed. And you'll notice that since I have backface culling on, the lines in wireframe that are eclipsed by the silhouette of the object are not rendered. So if I go back to object properties and turn backface culling off, now I will be able to see through and see the lines on the back of my object as well. But once again, in wireframe, the lines of the object are displayed as the color of the object. That is true as well for wireframe shaded, when the object is not selected. When it is selected, the lines or the wireframe is displayed as white. So what I tend to do most of the time, or what I like to do when dealing with a single object, I like to change the object color to black, so that in wireframe I get some black lines, and then I like to go open my material editor and apply a standard gray blend material to it. And what that does is that gives me a nice shaded gray object with black lines or a black wireframe on it, which is to me nice and aesthetically pleasing. Something else I like to do is eventually I like to hide the grid, which you can do by just pressing G. And you can bring it back by pressing G as well. So I'm just going to hide my grid now. And I'm just going to get right into these edit poly stuff. So at the very top here, you'll see something called the modifier list. The modifier list is a very, very powerful tool. Actually, a list of numerous different types of tools that you can use to modify your polygonal object. There's too many of those right now for me to get into too much detail, so I won't really talk about those too much. There's one or two of them that I want to show you at the very end, but that's it. I'm not going to talk about too many of those. But that's where you can find them. You can also go and click this little button at the bottom to actually configure your modifier sets. So if there are certain ones that you find you're using all the time that you like a lot and you use almost every time you model, then you can configure that here. So how to do that is to click this button and choose Configure Modifier Sets. And then again you have your list here, and you can take them and drag them over and set up your buttons by grabbing one and dragging it over. And then when you're done dragging your modifiers to these various buttons, and you can also change how many buttons you have. You can set it to 6 or continue all the way up to 18 or 20. I tend to keep it around 8 or 10. And then when you're done setting your modifiers, you can just type your name that you want to save your set as and say save. Then, if you want to see those buttons, you can come over here and say choose which one you want. I'm going to choose Caleb_basic. And then you can say show buttons. And that's going to show your modifier buttons. So now if you want to apply your modifier to the object, you can just click the button and that'll automatically do it. So as you can see, I have a few here. I have one that's edit poly, which basically is just the same thing as going convert to editable poly, except it applies it as a modifier. There's turbo smooth, which basically subdivides the model, and you can just crank up the iterations, and that's used for subdivision modeling. I won't look at that into too much detail. Then there's symmetry, which I'm going to show you in a little more detail later. And then there's normal. And normal basically just flips the normals of the selected object, the face normals, and will invert them. So as you can see, if I go to object properties and turn backface culling on, you can now see that the cube itself, the face normals, are inverted. Control Z to undo, by the way, and Control Y to redo. And you can also find those up here under Edit, Undo and Redo. So the normal will flip the face normals of the selected object or of the selected faces. So say you only want to flip one polygon. You can select that face and then hit normal. And pardon me, that should... Okay. For some reason it's doing it to the entire object, not just to the selected faces. Okay, that's interesting. Alright, well I'll look at that later anyways, but as you can see it flips the polygonal normals. That's what it does. To delete a modifier once it's been applied, just simply right click and say delete. If you want to collapse its effect into the model and turn the model back to an editable poly, you can do two things. You can either right click and say convert to editable poly, which will collapse the modifier's properties into the model, or you can right click and say collapse to, and just click yes. That little dialog comes up and says, are you sure you want to do that? And just say yes, unless you don't want to, and then you say no. The last thing that I want to show you is that you can do a few things. Most modifiers, you can click this little plus sign to open them up, and they have like things that you can adjust underneath. Each of them are different. And you can also turn this little light bulb on and off to display the effect of the modifier on the model. Or you can hit this button here, which basically, while you're working on your model, when you move down the stack, it will still display the end result of the modifier, even though you're working below it on the editable poly. So that may be a little difficult to understand now, but you'll get used to that later, and it's very useful to be able to work on the editable poly, but still display the result of a modifier that's applied above it on the modifier stack. So I'm just going to delete that modifier now and get into the editable poly tools. So the first thing that we're going to want to look at is we're going to want to look at selection. So selection is basically how to select the various different sub-elements of your object. So polygonal objects are made up of essentially 3 types of selections, or 4 when you really get down to it. You have your vertices, which are displayed by little dots, and for some reason my vertices are not displaying. Hold on, let me try to customize my preferences here. Okay, yeah, there we go. So under object properties, you need to turn on vertex ticks, and then now you'll be able to individually see your vertices, which are displayed as blue dots. So if you go over here to selection, the first one is vertex mode, so you just click that button, and then you can select an individual vertex and drag it around in world space. So that's how you can select your vertices. Another thing that you can do is you can select multiple vertices by holding Control and then clicking on each of them. So now I've selected all 4 of them. Or you can marquee select a whole selection of vertices, and again you can just move them around. So again, if you marquee select one vert and hold Control and marquee select some others, then that will allow you to continue adding to your selection. And if you want to subtract for your selection, just hold Alt, and then you can click on a vertex to subtract it, or you can marquee select to subtract those from your selection as well. So that's vertex selection. Then we have edge selection. Now, so that's pretty straightforward. You can just click on and select edges. Likewise, you can marquee select numerous edges. Now, one tool that's very useful that goes hand in hand with selection is this little box over here called Ignore Backfacing. Now, what Ignore Backfacing does is that you'll notice that if I marquee select a group of these edges, or even marquee select some vertices here, it will select directly through the object to anything that was on the other side of the object, but within my marquee. So if I marquee select these edges, it will still select this back edge. But what if I don't want to do that? Well, turn on Ignore Backfacing, and then you can marquee select something, and anything that is eclipsed by the model, anything that's on the back side of that model, will not be selected. So Ignore Backfacing is very useful. I tend to use it a lot, toggle it on and off. So it could be useful to set up a hotkey for that as well. So that's edge selection. Then we have ring selection or border selection. Border selection only works if you have a border. So say I delete a face on the model. Hold on. I'm going to turn off backface call here. Say I delete a face. Now I have a border around this hole. So I can use border selection to just quickly grab that border and select it. So I don't tend to use border selection very often, but it comes in handy sometimes if you have holes and you want to try to fill them, or things like that. Then you have face selection mode, or polygon selection mode. That one is very useful. Right now, I have it turned on so that when you select a polygon, it actually only shows the edges adjacent to the polygon that you have selected. You can turn on having the entire polygons being shown by hitting F2. If you hit F2 now, when you select a polygon, it will highlight the entire polygon in red. If you hit F2 again, then it will just show you the edges adjacent to the polygon that you have selected. So that's polygon selection. And then we have select by element, which is the last one to the right. Selecting by element will select an entire sub-element of an object. So later on, if you start having multiple pieces to an object, then you can select the elements individually. For instance, say I had another box over here, but that box is still part of the same object. You know, if I get out of Edit Poly here and I click on my object and I move them, they move together. They're still all part of this test object. But if I go into element selection mode, I can select each of them separately by element. Now, the last thing that I want to show you about selections is a really, really awesome tool which tends to speed up your workflow immensely when you get used to modeling in this way, or rather selecting in this way. What you can do is I can actually, using 3D Studio Max, I can use polygons to select edges, or polygons to select vertices, or edges to select polygons, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So, first of all, I'm just going to grab this polygon on the top of the box. Now, by holding Control and changing your selection mode, you will automatically select the sub-element that you changed to, which is adjacent to your selection. That sounds weird right now, but I'll show it to you in practice. So I have my polygon selected, I hit Control, and then I go to Vertex Selection mode. Now those 4 vertices are selected. If I went back to Polygon, my polygon would still be selected. Say I hold Control and I go to Edge mode. Now those edges adjacent to the face are selected. Likewise, if I choose an edge and I go to Face mode, now the faces that are adjacent to that edge are selected. And then I go back to Vertex mode. Now I have all of those vertices selected. Once again, you have to be holding Control for that to work. If you just go Face mode, select a face, and then go to Vertex mode, it will not remember your selection. But if you hold Control and go to Vertex mode, your vertices will remain selected. And you can tell because they're highlighted in red. So that's a very, very, very useful function when it comes to optimizing your workflow. One last thing that you can do here is you can also grow your selection. I'm just going to run a quick little operation for demonstration purposes. I'll show you how to do this later. So in order to grow a selection, let me do that one more time. Okay. So you can select a face or vertices, doesn't matter. Excuse me. I'm just going to drink some water here. Okay. So you select a face, and then you just hit Grow, and it will automatically select adjacent polygons to that face. Hit Shrink, and it goes backwards again. Same goes for edges, and same goes for vertices. So that's Grow and Shrink. Now I'm going to show you another very important function, which is the ring and loop tools. Now these tools only exist under Edge mode, but they're extremely useful for adding topology to your model. So basically, a ring are contiguous edges that flow parallel to one another around a model. So if you hit the ring button, you will automatically see that by selecting one edge and hitting ring, it selected all of the contiguous parallel edges around that box. Now, in order to show you loop mode, I have to try to do another function. So once again, I'm going to hit edge, then hit ring, and then now I'm going to use another very, very useful tool under the Edit Poly Object mode, which is over here under Edit Edges, and it's called Connect. So what Connect does, if you hit this little box, the Connect settings, is it will connect your selection of edges. It will run another edge between them, connecting them together. Now, under Connect Edges dialog box, you have some options. You can choose how many segments you want to use to connect it. So you can up that to 2, 3, 4, or 5. You can choose Pinch, which will either push them outwards or pull them inwards. Those of you who are familiar with subdivision modeling will be able to immediately see the usefulness of this option. And then you can do Slide. So you can either slide them, say you had one edge, you could just slide it over to one end or to the other end. Or you could just zero it out in the center. So that is the connect tool. And now I'm going to show you the loop tool. Loop tool allows you to select an edge loop, which is one single edge that flows continuously around a model. So if you select one edge and then you hit loop, that will automatically select around the entire edge loop around the object. And then you can take it and you can, translate it along. You can move it up or down, or you can take it and scale it inwards. You can do whatever you like with it. So that also brings up another important point, which is all those manipulator tools that I showed you previously, they all work on individual elements as well. So you can scale edges, or you can translate individual edges, or vertices, and so on and so forth. So you can already begin to see the immense amount of various different possibilities that are available to you with using this edit poly mode. So moving on, because this video is going to end up running on for too long if I talk too much about each thing. So some other important tools. I'll start with the polygon tools primarily. So let's look over here under Edit Polygons to the right. Oh, and by default, Max's sidebar here is set up like this, but I like to expand it somewhat. So I can drag it out once, or even twice by just grabbing and dragging it over. And then we can get more of these menus on one window at a time. So let's look at Edit Polygons, since we've already looked at selection. So, pardon me there, open up Edit Polygons. And so the first one that I'm going to want to look at is Extrude. Those of you who have used Maya or used other 3D applications will already know what Extrude does. It's your standard, almost your most commonly used modeling tool. I always use the dialog box. I never just hit the button. I always hit the settings box to the right there. So as you can see right away, you can extrude your polygon outwards or inwards based on the extrusion height setting that I'm editing here. You can also extrude by group, by local normal, or by polygon. Now, that doesn't show you anything with just one polygon selected. But say I select all 4 of these, or 5 of these polygons, and I hit extrude again, now you can immediately see the effect. By extruding by polygon, it extrudes each polygon individually as its own separate extrusion based on its local normal. If I say extrude by local normal, it will extrude all 5 of them, but it will extrude them based on their local normals as a single object. If I hit group, then it will extrude everything together as a single group of polygons, but following the average local normal of all of them. So once again, that's extrude by local normal, that's extrude by polygon, and that's extrude by group. So just say OK. And then, after you're done extruding, you can scale it outwards or scale it inwards, or do whatever you like with it. So I'll just scale it in for some fun there. Moving on, the next one that I'm going to want to show you is bevel. Bevel is like extrude, except that you have your height, but you also have your outline amount. So basically, it's like an extrude with the scale built into it, which is kind of nice. It just, gives you a little more fine-tune when you do your extrusion. You don't have to extrude first and then scale later. So that's bevel. And then we have outline. Now outline is basically the same function as the second slider of the bevel amount. So basically you have extrude, outline, and then bevel is extrude and outline put together into one tool. Moving on, we have Inset. Now Inset is a tool that I like very much. Actually, I'm going to put another loop through here. So I went to Edge mode, hit an edge, and I hit Ring to select the entire ring around the object, and then I hit Connect. And that will connect all the edges together. The reason I did that is I just want to be able to demonstrate Inset a little bit better, which is one of the other Polygon tools here. So I'll select these two faces, hit F2 so I can see them individually as their own selection, and then I'll hit Inset. Now what Inset does is exactly that. It insets some topology inwards from the selected polygons. It doesn't extrude them outwards or anything. It keeps them on the exact same polygon, but it just adds more topology. And then you can choose how much of an amount you want to inset. The other thing that you can do is you can inset them as a group, as a selection of polygons, or you can inset them individually by polygon. So that's Inset. And say I wanted to extrude now, I could go back and extrude it inwards, and then I could scale them individually, start to create some kind of a cool shape going on there. So that's the Inset function. Moving on, we have Bridge. Bridge is a very neat function as well. So to demonstrate that, I'll just delete some polygons. Now, in order to bridge, you actually need to be in edge selection mode, and then you can select two edges and hit Bridge, and it will build a polygon or bridge the gap in between them. And then what you can do is you can actually add segments to it. You can, change the smoothing degree that you want, and you can choose whether or not you want it to bridge over to adjacent edges. Now, you can use the Bridge tool with polygonal selections too, but it tends to be a little more tricky and finicky, and it kind of, confuses Max a little bit. So I tend to use Bridge mostly just with selecting edges and then deciding Bridge. I'll show you the function here now if I select a selection of 4 edges instead of just 2. So once again, it will bridge my whole selection together evenly. But what I can do is I can start to try to change it to bridge adjacent. And what that will do is it will change the triangulation. It will start to bridge polygons in a different way by changing the angle to which the bridge aims. So right now, the bridge is aiming perpendicular to my edge, but if I change the bridge adjacent, it will start to try to aim to different edges. This edge will try to bridge over to this edge, and so on and so forth. So that can also be rather useful in certain circumstances. So that's the Bridge tool. Now moving on, Flip. Flip just inverts the normal of individual polygons. So that's like the normal modifier that I showed you before, except for individual polygons. We will flip the normal. Now, Hinge from Edge. Hinge from Edge is a pretty interesting tool too, because you can basically, it's like an extrude, but you can choose an edge and have your extruded polygon hinge outwards from that extruded edge. So here, let's try that again from the top here. So hit Hinge from Edge, and then you can choose your hinge, and then you can choose your hinge angle, and you can choose your number of segments, and say OK. And you can create some really interesting geometry using that function as well. So that's Hinge from Edge. I'm going to skip Extrude along spline because I'm not going to show how to use splines in this tutorial. So that will be something for later. Same with edit triangulation, retriangulate and turn. I'm going to ignore those because those aren't exactly modeling operations. They have more to do with triangulation. Repeat last is an interesting button. It basically just repeats your last function that you performed. So, pretty straightforward. I won't talk about that too long. Constraints. Constraints is also very important. Constraining, what that does is any operation, any manipulation that you're running on a selection, it will constrain it to whatever constraint selection that you have. So right now I have constraint to edge. So if I try to translate this vertex, along the x-axis away from the model, it won't let me do anything because there's no edge there for it to constrain to. If I move it this way, however, it will follow that edge. It will constrain the translation of the vertex to that edge. Same with y, and same with z. And that also goes for multiple selections. It also goes for other different types of manipulation. If you try to scale an object or scale a selection, it even goes for polygons. Right now, it's being weird because I'm trying to scale these polygons inwards and it's trying to constrain them to some edges, which it doesn't quite understand. It understands scaling it outwards a little bit better. So that's constraints. You can constrain to edge, you can constrain to face, or you can constrain to normal. I typically just use edge and sometimes use face. Okay, preserved UVs we won't get into. That's a little more complex, and if I do a tutorial on UVs, on wrapping, then I might show you that one. Let's see, create. Create, it just allows you to draw a polygon by clicking vertices. Oh, I got confused there. You have to be careful about which ones you click, because if you click somewhere out in dead space, it will confuse the crap out of 3D Studio Max. So make sure you select the proper vertices. So that's create. I just created a new polygon by using that tool. Collapse. Collapse is something that's also very useful. Basically, you can select vertices and then hit collapse and it will just collapse them together. You can do that with a multiple selection. Say I want to select all of these by selecting the faces, holding control, and going to vertex selection mode. Then I can hit collapse and it will collapse everything together into one vertex. You can also just do it with straight up polygons too, actually. So that's collapse. Now, attach. Attach is also very useful. Basically, attach and detach work hand in hand together. And they allow you to attach separate objects to one another. So, and make them into one object. But they both have to be editable polys first. So say I create this cylinder here, and I go convert to editable poly. Then I go back to my weird test object here, and I say attach. I can now attach that cylinder, and it's no longer its own object. It is now part of my test object. Likewise, if I want it to become its own object again, I can say detach, and then I can detach it to an element, which it already is. I can detach it as a clone of the object. So I'm going to detach it as neither. I'm just going to detach it as its own object and call it cylinder again. So now, as you see, it goes back to being its own object. What you will notice, however, is that it no longer has its own pivot point and its own object color. It has inherited the pivot point of my test object and also the black object color of my test object. So that's very important to know. When you attach one object to another object and then detach it, it will detach with the properties of the object that you attached it to. And that can be very useful later in implementing certain workarounds. So the last thing that I want to show you here with polygons under Edit Geometry is, I'm going to skip a lot of this stuff. I want to show you Cut, actually. Cut is also a very useful tool. In order to cut, basically you can just select the Cut tool and then click anywhere across your model. and it will just cut edges through that model. So that's very useful when dealing with organic modeling. If you just want to, cut a polygonal shape in, and then, try to triangulate it and stuff later, then you can do that. So that's the cut tool. The next one that I want to show you is, hide selected, hide unselected, and unhide all. So basically, if you have polygons that are obscuring your view of another part of the model, when you start getting into more complex models, or if you even have sub-objects or sub-elements that you want to hide. Pardon me, I have to turn off my edge constraints. So say you have sub-elements or sub-objects that you want to hide because they're, blocking your view of the model. Then what you can do is you can just select those polygons, or even select that element, and then say hide selected. Likewise, if you want to hide anything else other than it, you can say hide unselected. And that will hide the rest of the polygons of that object. And then if you want to show everything again, you can just say unhide all. So that's hide selected and hide unselected. Now the last thing that I want to show you is smoothing. In order to properly demonstrate that, I'm going to turn off the wireframe mode. So you'll notice that around the model, you have certain polygons that are smoothed nicely into one another, like this arc here. You'll have others that are not smooth at all, like these extruded points. When you extrude polygons, they don't smooth together by default. So in order to do that, you need to use what we call smoothing groups. That's over here under Polygon Smoothing Groups. I'm going to hide the rest of this stuff because it's not necessary and will be confusing. So what Polygon Smoothing Groups are this. They're a number assigned to polygons. You can assign any number to any polygon, and it doesn't matter what order they are. You don't have to assign them in any sort of sequence. It's just a group number. It's like if you were trying to split people up into two groups and you said, you're in group number 1 and you're in group number 2. That's what you're telling the polygons to do. And then basically, any polygon that is in the same group as another polygon will smooth with the polygons that are in that same group as them. So to demonstrate this, you'll see that these 3 polygons here have different group numbers. This first one here has no group number. This one is 3, and you can see that by the fact that it's highlighted in orange. And this one again has no group number, because no numbers are highlighted in orange. So I'm going to select all 3 of these polygons. I'm going to say clear all, and then I'm going to put them in smoothing group 14. That was just arbitrary, by the way. I just chose 14 because I figured none of these other polygons in the model would likely be using the number 14. So now, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to probably put all of these polygons here in the same smoothing group. But I'm not going to want them to be in 14, because if they're in 14, the angle here is too harsh, and if I try and smooth them together, watch what happens. You get a very strange sort of smoothing that's happening, because it's trying to smooth something that's almost a 90-degree angle with something else that's almost a 90-degree angle away from it. So we don't want to do that. So I'm going to turn it on to number 15. Then likewise, I'm going to select these polygons here. I'm going to say clear all, and I'm going to put them in 15 because they're separated by the one that's in group number 14. I'm going to select these bottom ones. I'm going to say clear all, and I'm going to put them in group number 14. So that about does it for smoothing. Maybe I'll put these ones here on the side. I'll clear them and put them into 14 as well. Or, sorry, what do we have here for the side? We have 6. So I'm going to go and put these ones in 6. And the other side here seems to be smoothing alright. Let's just find out. Okay, apparently these have no smoothing group. So I'm going to select all of them. I'm going to put them all in the very same smoothing group. We'll give them 16. And now you have a model that's kind of smoothing together a little bit more nicely. So that's smoothing groups. Now I'm just going to move on to some of the edit edges tools and some of the edit vertex tools, and that will conclude our demo of the editable poly tools. So under edit edge, you've already seen the ring command, and you've already seen the loop command. So now let's look at some things that we can do with those. So one of the first things that you might want to look at is remove. Say you added too much topology here to this edge, so you want to remove this loop. So you can select one edge, say loop, and then hit remove. Now this is very important though. If I go to vertex mode, you'll notice that the corresponding vertices for that edge are still there, even though the edge itself is not. Now the reason for that is because if you just hit remove, it only works on that element. It doesn't work on the corresponding elements to that element. So you'd have to go to vertex mode and hit remove too if you wanted to get rid of those vertices. But there's a faster way to do that. What you can do is you can go back to your loop that you selected, and then you can hold Control and hit remove. Now what that will do is, just like hitting Control and moving over to vertex mode, it will remove the corresponding elements to that edge as well. So that's the remove tool. Like extruding a polygon, you can also extrude an edge. So when you extrude an edge, however, it will give you a base to extrude it from. And all the vertices attached to that edge will split apart and break into multiple vertices. So as you can see, by extruding this edge, I end up with a few n-gons here, which would later need to be triangulated. But I also end up with some somewhat cool sort of effects here. So while we're on the topic of triangulating, that will bring me to my next point, which is I'm going to show you the weld dialog. So with the weld dialog, you can weld on faces, you can weld on edges, and you can weld on verts. So basically what the weld does is it will weld the vertices that correspond with your selection based on a threshold. So with these two edges that I have selected, they each have two vertices that correspond to them. If I wanted to collapse those vertices or weld them together, I could select my edge selection, and then I could crank up my weld threshold. And when I get to a certain point, okay, hold on here. Let's move to vertex selection, crank up my selection. Okay, so pardon me, it doesn't work with edges, and in fact I rarely use that anyways. I always weld with vertices. So basically I cranked up my weld threshold after selecting those edges and then changing them to vertex selection. And as you can see, it collapses them together. And if I keep bringing up my threshold, it will collapse greater and greater distance vertices together until it ends up collapsing my entire selection. Also, if I want, I can add to my selection. And eventually I can weld all the other vertices in my selection together too. If I crank this up even more, then I'll end up welding all of those front end vertices together. But that's a little bit too much. Now another way to weld vertices or to triangulate is this button next to the weld button, which is called target weld. Now what target weld does is it allows you to grab a vertex and then just drag it over to the other vertex which you would like to weld it to. So that tool itself has a ton of various different applications, but it's very straightforward. Just click on one vertex, click on the other one that you would like to weld it to, and voila, it will just bang it over to the next vertex there. So that's the target weld. I'm going to move back over to edge. Again, target weld works with edges. You can target weld edges together, but I tend not to use it in that capacity. I always use target weld with vertices. Moving on with the edge tool, we have our connect tool, which I've already shown you. So I'll show you that to you one more time. You just make your selection and then hit connect, and you can choose how many segments you want to put in there. You can pinch them together or move them outwards, and so on and so forth. So that's connect. Once again, you can repeat last if you like. And actually, after that, there's not too much more that I want to show you with the edge selection tool. So lastly, we have our vertex selection. Many of the different options in vertex selection are the same as they are in both polygon and edge selection. We have our remove tool, where we can remove the vertex. And most of the time when you remove the vertex, however, it will remove the corresponding edges, unless the vertex is just out there in the middle of a polygon or something. So we have remove. We have break, which I tend not to use very often. But what break does is it will basically break apart all of the polygons, the corners of the polygons attached to that vertex. Or it will break that vertex into 4 different vertices, or 3, depending on how many polygons are touching that vertex. And that can be useful for certain things, if you want to punch a hole in something at the location of a vertex. Then you can use break to break that off. Likewise, if we want to, we can also extrude a vertex. I've got to undo a little bit more there. There we go. So again, just like extruding an edge, if we hit extrude, the extrude dialog, then you'll have your extrusion base and your extrusion height. And it will create 4 vertices, or however many polygons are touching that vertex at the base of your extrusion. So that's how to extrude a vertex. Another thing that we can do is we can chamfer. Now chamfering is just like extruding, except that it doesn't extrude a polygon out. It just creates a new polygon in between the vertices by chamfering them apart. So if I wanted to create some more topology there, where that vertex is, I could just easily go and chamfer my vertex to create some more topology there. The last thing that I want to show you is connect. Connecting is simple. You just grab, it works different with vertices than it does with edges. You can just grab 2 vertices and say connect, and it will draw an edge in between them. In fact, however, you can even grab 2 or more vertices, as I'm about to show you. Say I wanted to triangulate this n-gon. I can grab these 3 vertices and hit connect, and it will connect edges in between all 3 vertices in the most logical way. So now I've already created that polygon there by chamfering it, and I have everything nicely triangulated over. And if I wanted to now, I could go ahead and I could bevel it, and then I could go ahead and collapse it if I wanted to, and try to create a neat little shape there. And we're almost finished. The last thing that I want to show you, which is really good for subdividing objects or doing subdivision modeling, is what's known as a chamfer. I missed it with when I was demonstrating the edge tools, so I'll show it now. So you can select an edge or a loop of edges, and then you just go over here to chamfer, and what it will do is it will create as many edges as you designate under the number of segments, and it will average the fall off of those edges. It will basically round that corner, that edge out. And based on the chamfer amount, it will do it more widely and more smoothly based on the number of segments. So again, if you just do 1 segment, it will just chamfer it on a 45 degree. If you bump it up to 3 or 4, you get a much rounder chamfer. And you can do that on any number of edges if you like. You have to be careful where you do it to, because it will create some weird n-gons and stuff on corresponding geometry. If you do it on edges that are attaching to other geometry. In this case, it didn't create any n-gons that I didn't already have though. So there you have it. That is my introduction to 3D Studio Max interface and polygonal modeling tools under the Edit Poly modifier. I hope that was very informative to you, and I hope that will give you the basis to begin trying to create some models of your own using these very powerful tools to edit your geometry. Stay tuned for the next portion of this tutorial where I will show you these polygonal modeling tools in a practical application by modeling a very cool retro TV. This has been Caleb Ellsworth for CG Text Plus, and have a good afternoon.